they've been here for 17,000 years. And then, but the very first Europeans who tried to settle in North America were the Vikings, or otherwise known as the Norse, and they came here in the year 1000. And then roughly 1,000 years later, a Norwegian couple were able to decipher the ancient Icelandic saga and determine the location to be the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland, which is off to the east of us. The very first people who tried to colonize Canada were the French. They came here in the year 1604 with Samuel de Champlain, and he was from Bordeaux in the southwestern part of France. I think because he was a cartographer, among many other talents he had, I believe he decided that the climate should probably be much like that of Bordeaux, and boy was he in for a surprise, because of course we have winter here, big time winter, and so anyway, it was very difficult. And but the very first piece of literature written in French was written in the province of Nova Scotia. The province of Nova Scotia means New Scotland. There's a car right here, and I don't know what he's going to do. He's okay. There. Okay. Yeah. So when Halifax was founded, it was a British fort, and there were 5 forts at that time. A citadel, like this one here we have in front of us, is a fort at the top of a hill or a cliff overlooking the town that it protects. And directly below, right here to the right, is the town that it protected. Now, there were 4 other forts. They have eroded in time, but the citadel has always stayed. Now, this is the 4th citadel. The other 3 were eroded, and then finally the British decided to build one to last. It took 28 years, and this one was finished in 1856, and it is stone, and it's very significant. This clock to the immediate right is called the town clock. This was a gift from Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the only member of the royal family who lived in Canada for an extended period of time. He was here for 28 years. He was a bit of a controversial figure because he was Anglican and English, and he had a French mistress known as Judy Saint Laurent. She was French and Catholic. It was a true love romance. They were together for many years, and he built a heart-shaped pool for her on the outskirts of the city. This is the entrance of the citadel right here. You can see the guards standing there. 78 Highlanders. They were here for a 2-year period. If you look to the right, you can see the city of Dartmouth on the other side of Halifax Harbour. This is a harbour. It's not a river. Many people mistake it for a river, but it is a harbour. If you look to the left, you can see the fortifications, the ditch that surrounds the citadel. It's not a moat, it's a ditch. We're at the top of a hill, so you can't keep water here. If you look into the distance over to the right, you can see the bridge. You might see the 2 bridges actually, but the first bridge is the McDonald Bridge. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And directly in front of us, you can see over to the right, you can see a building with a slanted roof, white lines and diamonds are on it. That's the Centennial Pool, which is about 54 years old, built for Canada's centennial. After the American Revolution, the United Empire Loyalists came to Canada, to British North America. Up until that point, Canada was essentially a French-speaking nation, and then suddenly half the nation is English. It took us a while to figure how we're going to live together until 1867, when we became a nation, and we became known as the Dominion of Canada, much like the island of Newfoundland was the Dominion of Newfoundland and Labrador. If you look directly in front of us, that's the Citadel High School. They offer courses in English and in French. Most of the schools in the province of Nova Scotia offer courses in English and French. This school also offers courses in Gaelic. So there is a Gaelic population in the province of Nova Scotia, relatively small, but for those people who are truly interested in learning the Gaelic Gaelic language, they can study at the Gaelic College in the northern part of the province. We have lots of trees here. Halifax is called the City of Trees, and it's a very beautiful city. In 2003, we had a hurricane hit the city directly on, and when that happened, the city was shut down for an entire week. We lost 70,000 trees in the city, and then 6 months later, we had a snowstorm called White Wand, and we had 1 meter of snow fall in a 24-hour period. Looking to the left, you can see some flag poles. The closest one to us right over here is the Union Jack flag, which is the Canadian flag until the year 1966. The two other masts are to indicate the military vessels that were coming into Halifax, and the other one was to allow the merchants in downtown Halifax to know what merchant vessels were coming into the city. This part of the hill over here to the immediate right is the part where young people toboggan down the hill in wintertime. I know some people are complaining about cold, but this actually for us is pretty nice weather. But that's the way it is. Now, if you look directly ahead of us, you can see the entranceway of Halifax Harbour. Halifax Harbour is considered the second best harbour in the world after Sydney, Australia. And out there you can see an island, that's McNabb's Island. It has fortifications much like what we have here, but to a smaller, they're smaller. And when Halifax was founded, Halifax was a garrison town, and people wanted to escape, and so they would row over to that island, or they would sail over to the island where they would have feasts and social events and parties and picnics. If you look to the immediate right, over there you can see the steeple of the St. Mary's Basilica. It has the highest granite spire in all of Canada. And from this direction you can see the leaves are turning green. The leaves have just come out on the trees in the last few weeks. They're a delicate green, a light pale green, but of course they change over time. Most of these trees are maple trees. Maple trees are genetically predisposed to live for 300 or 350 years, and they will produce the same color leaves each and every fall. So if they're yellow this year, they'll be yellow next year, or orange this year, they'll be orange next year, and red as well. Those are the three main colors of the trees, but of course in the springtime, as we are now they are green. We're going to be turning left. The city was designed so that when you, at the top of this hill here, you could look down and see water from the tops of the streets. And this building to the immediate left was a schoolhouse at the time of the Halifax explosion, and the window on the other side faced the direction of the explosion, and when the children saw the burning Mont Blanc ship, they ran to the window. The teachers wisely sent the children back to their seats, and a few minutes later, and closed the curtains. And a few minutes later, when the explosion occurred, glass broke from the windows and stuck in the curtains, and none of the children were blinded. So you're looking right down to the water at the very bottom. Now, the very first piece of theater that was written in Canada was written in the French language in 1607 by a gentleman by the name of Marc Lescarbot to welcome Samuel de Champlain back from his travels from Cape Cod. And the name of that play was called Neptune, and that's what they call our regional theater, Neptune Theater. Is everybody okay in terms of heat on the bus? Is it warm enough or cold enough? Or okay? It's only problematic when one person says it's too cold and another one says it's too hot. Anyway, we're all good. So we're headed down to the very downtown core. This is where all of the historically oldest buildings are in the city. Now, as I mentioned, the Mi'kmaq people have been here for 17,000 years. Last year, the province of Nova Scotia announced that Mi'kmaq was the first language of the province of Nova Scotia. That does not mean that everybody's going to start studying. So here's the Neptune Theatre right on the right here. You can see it, Neptune Theatre. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to start speaking Mi'kmaq tomorrow, because we don't have the language well enough entrenched in the province to do that. But it will mean that both provincial and federal funds will go to ensure that Mi'kmaq language courses are eventually offered in the schools, and that people will be able to learn that, and the Mi'kmaq language will be saved. Because the Mi'kmaq, the European settlers signed an agreement with the Mi'kmaq people, an agreement of peace and friendship. They remind us each and every day in the school system, at least where I teach, that we signed an agreement, and this is their land. And you can see Halifax Harbour is really quite wide at this point. Just in front of us you can see the Pride flag. Halifax has the fourth largest Pride parade in Canada, which is unusual in considering that it is the 10th largest city with a population of 480,000, less than a half a million. An interesting story about our Prime Minister, present-day Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was in a Pride parade in Toronto about 6 years ago when a topless 22-year-old girl ran up to him and hugged him and wished him happy Pride, and then she asked for a selfie, and the Prime Minister agreed. And I ask you, in what other nation would that happen? And I can't think of any other country that scenario would play out. Directly in front of us over here to the right now is the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, which has the largest collection of artifacts of the Titanic. It was always seen as a good thing to salvage anything that was salvageable from the sea to do so, and that has a great collection of artifacts from the Titanic. To the left of us, the Bank of Nova Scotia right here. 2 of the 5 biggest banks in Canada were founded in Halifax. Directly in front of us is a Canadian institution known as Tim Hortons. He was a hockey player, and when he retired, he opened a coffee shop, and it caught on like wildfire. I think it's because in Canada, we love our hockey, even though it's a very violent sport. Directly in front of us are historic properties to the left and to the right. These are the oldest buildings in the city of Halifax, or almost the oldest. And even though the largest employer in the city of Halifax is the Canadian Navy, 80% of the Canadian Navy is located in the province of Nova Scotia. 20% is on the west coast in a place called Esquimalt. A second large employer is the Canadian universities. We have 9 universities in Halifax. One of them is called NASCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, which is located among these buildings here. It has an international reputation. There's also an Acadian university, meaning that the courses there are taught in the French language. Directly ahead of us is Purdy's Wharf. It's a building that that uses the water from Halifax Harbor to heat the building in winter and to cool it in the summertime. The part of the city we are in now is called the Cogswell Interchange. It's basically a highway development that opened up in the 1960s. It's now seen as a mistake to put a highway development in the downtown core of a city, and it's all going to be replaced by multi-purpose buildings, apartment buildings, condominiums, and parks. Coming on the right-hand side is Casino Nova Scotia, a type of investment bank for some people. I've invested there, but didn't get the return I did like it. And for the next long section, you're going to see how extensive the Canadian Navy is as a part of the city of Halifax. Do keep in mind that the city of Halifax grew up along the waterfront, so all the parts of the city you're going to see for the next few minutes will be the area in which the city grew. And up in the distance you can see the McDonald Bridge, the Angus L. McDonald Bridge, which opened in the year 1955. And in more recent years, they decided that the bridge needed to be raised, so they lifted the building up 2 meters to accommodate the height of the incoming cargo ships. And they were able to keep the bridge open during the day, and they would do all the work at night and on the weekends. It was a phenomenal job. They would lower pieces of the bridge to barges below, do the work on it, and then raise them up again. So we have some public housing units just past this red and white Spice building. You'll see public housing buildings. 2 of the large sections are Uniacke Square and Mulgrave Park. This is Uniacke Square Park. So we have bicycle lanes over to the immediate right where there are some joggers as well. So we've had some fires recently, and so they're banning fires, and they're putting notices that if you set a fire, you're going to be fined $25,000. Fires are a big issue right now. Now we've had rain for the last 3 days, I suppose. This is not really rain. This is just a little bit of drizzle, but it is what it is. As we travel along, you can see that Halifax Harbor is getting significantly narrower. way up ahead on the right-hand side, you can see 3 red and white towers. That's a oil-fired electricity generating station. That's how we get most of our energy. However, increasingly we're building wind farms and windmills all over the place, as well as some solar panels. Climate change is a consideration for every country in the world at this point, and so we're doing our part. You can see some, this is all military on the left and on the right. Directly ahead of us, the Halifax shipyard. It's a assembly hall. They are building icebreakers for the Canadian North. Canada is the second biggest nation in the world, and in the 1/3 of Canadian geography is called permafrost, or permanently frozen land, meaning there are no trees. And this is where the Inuit or the Eskimo people live, and there are no roads to this part of Canada, and as a consequence you have to build the icebreakers are needed to ensure that these communities are supplied with food and needed supplies to allow them to grow. There are 10 provinces in Canada and 3 territories. Okay, so just on the right-hand side of this assembly hall, you're going to be able to see an icebreaker, a new one. It takes about 8 months to build an icebreaker. It's not a quick process. Then if you look to the left, just as we get up here, you can see a gentleman in an African-Canadian image on the brick wall there. Nova Scotia has 57 African-Canadian communities, and I'll be talking a little bit more about one particular one that we're going to visit. So if you look to the right, you can see an icebreaker right there. That's what an icebreaker looks like. They don't look like sailboats. They're rather rough. This is Mulgrave Park to the left of us. And right over there in front of the 3 towers is where the Halifax explosion occurred. Now, Halifax Harbor is approximately 22 kilometers in length. During the last period of glaciation 22,000 years ago, the glacier eroded the earthen wall between the lake in front of us and the inlet, and as a consequence the lake became open to the Atlantic Ocean, and it's now called Bedford Basin. It's one of the reasons why Halifax Harbor is such a perfect location. It's naturally deep, and it's an extremely successful port for the importation of containers. And up here is the McKay Bridge, which opened 15 years after the McDonald Bridge. It opened in the year 1970. Pull over by that thing, or just beyond it, wherever you prefer. And that speaks of the development of Halifax and its growth in more recent times. And directly in front of us is Bedford Basin, which is access to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, we're going to stop here for a moment and I'll explain in greater detail the Halifax explosion. Perfect. So the Halifax explosion was the single biggest man-made explosion in the world until the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War. At that point in time, Bedford Basin was basically a parking lot for ships, and they would make convoys and they would travel together to Europe. At this point in time, to keep with Germany was the enemy, although we're quite friends with Germany now, but at that point in time during the First World War, they were the enemy, and we had to keep the German submarines out of Halifax Harbor. We had 2 metal nets at the entranceway of Halifax Harbor. And here in the Bedford Basin Park, we had a ship called the Emo. It was a Belgian relief ship. It was a longer ship and it was empty, meaning it was more difficult to navigate. The other ship that was involved in the collision was a French munition ship known as the Mont Blanc. The Mont Blanc had arrived to Halifax on December 5th, 1917. This is in the middle of the war. And Halifax at this point in time had a population of 55,000 people. Halifax, Dartmouth side had a population of only 5,000 people. Right over here was a Mi'kmaq community, which was completely destroyed, and the Mi'kmaq people have never returned to this area. Anyway, when the Mont Blanc arrived, it was laden with explosives, 2,000 tons of TNT and a chemical known as benzol that was kept in large drums on the deck of the ship. The captain no doubt spent a worrisome evening fearing, because he couldn't come into the protection of Bedford Basin. He was no doubt fearful that the German submarines would target his ship, and because it was filled with explosives, it was very dangerous. On December 6, 1917, 8:30, they lowered the metal net, and the two ships decided to, the Mont Blanc decided to enter, the captain of the ship, of course, decided to enter Halifax Harbor. The captain of the Emu decided to leave, and it was in this area here that the two ships collided. And when they collided, there were sparks. And once there were sparks, there was fire. And the sailors on the Mont Blanc knew that the ship was going to explode, so they immediately lowered the life rafts and rowed for the Dartmouth shore, because they were closer to there. Meanwhile, people in the city of Halifax, particularly in this area here, did not know what was going on. People could see the smoke of the burning ship, and many wanted to help, and they came down to the shores. And then exactly 9:05 in the morning, December 6th, the explosion occurred. Well, first of all, every part of the city was affected by the explosion. It broke windows in every part of the city, and there were houses that were completely destroyed in this part here known as Richmond. And people who had come down, well, first of all, between 7,000 and 9,000 people were affected. 2,000 people were instantly killed. The benzol went up into the air and rained down on the town, and because there were many fires, it just fueled the fires. Fortunately and unfortunately, there was a major storm the following day, which put out many of the fires, which was good, but it made it very difficult to recover people. And as a consequence, it was a very dire situation. We received aid from all